Guys, it's another mailbag episode, but in so doing, we really need to have a serious conversation about the Falcons wide receiver position.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Of course, we want to give a special shout out to those everydayers that have been staying strong all year long. We are almost there. Training camp is virtually upon us, and I really appreciate all of you guys that have listened to all 100 and whatever episodes we have done so far this season. So follow in their footsteps by subscribing for free or on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcast. So the news of today is the Falcons are wearing their throwback jerseys with the red helmets for 3 games this year at home. Week 2 against the Packers, week 6 against the Commanders, week 12 against the Saints after that bye week. And if you missed the news earlier this offseason, no gradient jerseys this year, but it's all good, right? I'm not necessarily that invested in jerseys and helmets and what the Falcons wear. The thing I'm invested in is, did you win the game or not, right? But hey, if you guys are very much invested in jerseys and helmets and all that stuff, hey, like what you like. Don't let some guy on the internet tell you how to live your life. But we will continue today's episode talking about something that at least I deem a lot more serious and answer some listener questions, all from the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below. But our first one comes from AC94. Yes. Does Randall Cobb being put on the PUP list hinder Corey Davis watch? Now, maybe. I don't know enough about Cobb's recovery from his ankle surgery that he had in March to know if he's going to be on the PUP list for a matter of days or weeks, right? And I certainly think if he's on the PUP list for weeks, that does potentially affect Corey Davis watch here on this illustrious podcast. But basically, again, for those of you that don't know exactly what the PUP list is, and we'll probably have to discuss it at some point next week because it's related to Caleb Huntley, not related to Kyle Pitts. If you missed the news earlier this week, he is expected to be 100% when training camp kicks off next week. But basically, the PUP list at the beginning of training camp is for those guys who aren't 100% healthy enough to practice. And when they are 100% healthy enough to practice, they come off that PUP list. And so as that applies to Corey Davis, we've heard for months now that the Jets fully intend to keep Corey Davis. And I believe, in whether, that's related to the Randall Cobb issue or unrelated to the Randall Cobb issue, I think the Jets truly, at least as of today, believe that, right? I certainly think Cobb being less than 100% probably easily could be made to be a contributing factor to the Jets believing that Corey Davis has a role on this team this upcoming season, to be that number 3 wide receiver over a Randall Cobb. I think part of it is the Jets believe themselves to be a Super Bowl contender, right? And they know that having a strong and deep wide receiver core will be beneficial to them potentially making that run this year, because we've seen in recent years with Aaron Rodgers as their quarterback that if he has confidence and trust in his wide receivers, like he did in 21 and 22 when he had Devontae Adams and others, he can be an MVP caliber player. And when he doesn't have that, like he didn't have in 2023, he is less than that. Still good, but not elite, right? And I think the Jets believe that Corey Davis is part of their plan right now. And my issue is, are they going to believe that when we get to the end of August? Are they going to believe that when we get to the end of October and the trade deadline hits, right? Because that's really the window for, August is when they might cut or trade to Corey Davis. October could be when they decide to trade. It's not we're on Corey Davis watch. As I told you guys in the spring, this is something that is going to be months in the making, not days or weeks in the making. Now, I think on the flip side, when you look at the perspective of the Falcons, I think the Falcons currently believe in Mack Hollins as their number 2 and are content with Mack Hollins as their number 2. And that makes perfect sense for the Falcons, Mack Hollins is a capable complementary weapon. I've said this before, right? Me thinking the Falcons are going to try to upgrade that number 2 position isn't necessarily a shot at Mack Hollins, right? Although I will probably take what some of you guys deem to be a shot at Mack Hollins as we continue this conversation. But, you go back to this podcast in March of 2022, before Hollins signed with the Raiders, I was sitting here on this podcast advocating for the Falcons to sign Mack Hollins because as a backup receiver up to that point in his NFL career that was catching like 10 or 15 passes a year, right? I thought he was more capable of that. So basically, this very humble podcast host basically predicted the Mack Hollins 2022 breakout year, 6 months prior to it actually happened. So you can check the tape on that. Again, Hollins is fine as a number 2 wide receiver like he was in Las Vegas when you're running your offense through arguably the best wide receiver in the league, Davante Adams, and the most productive running back in the league, Josh Jacobs, right? Hollins in that situation, right? Those guys are driving the offense. Hollins in that situation is a backseat passenger, right? And I said last month when we were breaking down the wide receiver group, it's very similar to the situation that we had with Mohamed Sanu when he was the number 2 here in yesteryear, when the Falcons had the then best wide receiver in the league in Julio Jones and a strong running game led by Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman, right? And I think the Falcons are absolutely fine convincing themselves that with the expectation that our run game is going to have with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, and even though we don't have an individual receiver on par with Julio or Devontae Adams, you can make a case that the combination of a healthy Kyle Pitts and Drake London, and now in year 2, are going to be equal to basically having that caliber of receiver in their offense. And so those are the things that are driving this offense, and they're content with Mack Hollins being, again, that backseat passenger that he has shown himself to be capable of being. Now, my concern with Mack Hollins is what happens if Drake London twists his ankle and misses a month? What happens if Kyle Pitts strains his hamstring and is limited for 6 weeks? Then you need something more than that backseat passenger that Hollins has been, that Sanu has been. You need somebody that can at least sit in the front seat as a passenger, right? And Mack Hollins is not that guy. Mo Sanu was not that guy. I think Corey Davis is much closer to being that guy. But I don't feel like the Falcons have to feel like they have to get that guy right now today, because as I've said many times on this podcast, they are entering phase 2 of their rebuild, right? This is the part of the rebuild where they're still kind of lining up all their pieces, getting all their ducks in a row. Phase 3 is when all the pieces are in place and now you're going to make that run. And I don't think the Falcons will have Mack Hollins as their number 2 receiver in phase 3. But again, they're not in phase 3 quite yet. Now, whether we're moving into phase 3 by this season, next season, or sometime in the future, or never, time will tell. But again, eventually, I think that move to upgrade the wide receiver position so that the Falcons move to phase 3 is coming. It is an eventuality, and so I think the Falcons accept this and know this. It's part of the reason why they only gave Mack Hollins a 1 year, $2.5 million deal, right? They are not married to Mack Hollins long-term. They do not see him as a long-term answer. And they're also paying him, I think he has the lowest salary of any projected starting receiver in the NFL that is not on a rookie contract. Right. And so the Falcons are not clearly paying him like they expect him to be this high end receiver, which is part of the reason why I push this narrative, because the Falcons are basically telling us, yes, Mack Hollins is basically a bridge, right? That he is basically as capable as what other teams are paying their number 3 and number 4 wide receivers. That's what Mack Hollins is. That's what the Falcons are telling us. And it goes back to a conversation we had last summer when I first coined the nickname and the alias Sirius Black, when I was arguing then with the Mariota stands that were, giving me a lot of flack in the YouTube comments at that time, because I was basically not sitting here blowing smoke up, the everydayers' butts each and every day, trying to convince you that Marcus Mariota was anything more than a bridge quarterback, that he was a bridge to Desmond Ridder. And the question was whether or not that bridge was going to last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it was going to be, but it was a bridge. That's all it was going to be. And basically what I'm sitting here telling you is Mack Hollins is also a bridge. I am not going to sit here and blow smoke up your butt and tell you that Mack Hollins is anything more than a bridge at that number 2 position. And again, whether that's a 6-week bridge, a 6-month bridge, Time will tell on that situation. But Mack Hollins is here to do 5 things in this team. He's going to run 4 routes, a dig, a slant, an out, and a fade. And then the 5th thing he's going to do is block. That's what he's here to do. And in phase 2 of the Falcons rebuild, that is more than fine for what they're looking for at that number 2 position. But as I said earlier, if and when they get to phase 3 and they are an established playoff team that actually wants to try and do real damage in January, they are going to be looking for a different and better option at that spot. Someone that can do more than 5 things, maybe someone that can do 10 things. And I'm not even here to convince you that Corey Davis is, the final piece to that puzzle. What I do know is Corey Davis has been a very productive number 2 wide receiver that can get you close to 1,000 yards in a top 5 passing attack, because he did exactly that in 2020 in Arthur Smith's offense in Tennessee, right? Which is what I think is much more what you're looking for from a number 2 receiver when we get to phase 3, right? But even if Corey Davis isn't that guy anymore, and he's also just a bridge, I think he's a much sturdier bridge. He's a bridge made out of stone rather than a bridge that Mack Hollins is, that is made out of ropes and sticks, right? And so basically, my thing with Corey Davis and the Jets is I'm calling their bluff, right, on their willingness to keep him, right? But I also called the Ravens bluff on their willingness to put a non-exclusive franchise tag on Lamar Jackson back in February. And I was wrong on that. And I could be very much wrong on Corey Davis not being a New York Jet by the end of the season. And they may ultimately keep him for the entirety of the year, and Corey Davis watch comes to an end at some point in the coming months. But whether we're talking about Corey Davis today, or Gabe Davis, or Darnell Mooney, or Van Jefferson tomorrow when those guys are free agents this upcoming offseason, or we're talking about some draft pick that the Falcons are going to pull the trigger on in the top 100 in next year's draft, the Falcons are eventually going to upgrade over Mack Hollins as their number 2. It is just a matter of when, not if. That is why that's the serious conversation that we will continue to have here on this illustrious podcast. And we will continue having a very serious conversation about the state of the running back position that has been the talk of all this week in the NFL. And I'll give my 2 cents on that from a listener question that deals with that subject as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. And first, guys, I want to tell you about our partners over at eBay Motors, who have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each and every week all season long. And whether you're looking to prep for the draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed to fit your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us in this week's eBay Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. And we talked about yesterday making that smooth turn at the end of round 1 and round 2, beginning of round 2, with double dipping on wide receivers yesterday. Let's talk about double dipping with running backs, with that 1-2 punch to provide that horsepower that you're looking for with Jonathan Taylor and Nick Chubb back-to-back. Taylor is a perfect rebound candidate, given how much more run-friendly the Colts offense is going to be this year with Anthony Richardson and Shane Steichen. And Chubb is still set up to dominate in Cleveland. I think, getting to the conversation we're going to have coming up, I think this might be the last year of Nick Chubb being that dominant workhorse. So making a big bet on Nick Chubb, I think, makes a ton of sense. And Vinny has helped us, build a championship caliber roster and win our fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows that a championship team is about giving each player, to build that team being a perfect fit. And the same is true with your vehicle. With eBay's guaranteed fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly, whether it's air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shock struts, you name it, eBay Motors has it, and they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car, because eBay's guaranteed fit helps you understand exactly what part you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forth, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating if your ride needs a little fixing up, because now you know that you will always be set up for success from the get-go with eBay Guaranteed Fit. Everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. So, continuing today's conversation with a listener question from Spacebar in the Discord, he says, there's been a bit of an uproar in regards to the value of running backs in the last few days. It got me thinking about your prediction of running the ball coming back in vogue over the next few years. It's not lost on me that you can have a good running game without an elite running back. So, it got me thinking about the value of the position, which I think will become more valuable over the next few years versus the value of the players who play said position and how they should be compensated. What is your take on the potential dichotomy, leaving Bijan out of this because he's a unicorn? Why would even a run-heavy team opt for a good running back on the cheap over a great running back that's more expensive? And how do you think players themselves respond to the dwindling market of teams willing to pay them after the rookie deal? So, Spacebar, you ask a lot of questions, and I don't 100% know what you're asking for. So I will say, if I don't get exactly what you want me to answer, we can talk about it later this weekend and Saturday. I know you're a regular at the symposiums that we do in the Discord. And for those of you that don't know, the symposiums is something that I do for the Discord. It's basically a Twitter space. We do it every Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern. They run for a couple of hours where we talk about whatever people's on their mind. So if you want to potentially have more of this conversation beyond what we talk about on today's episode, we can do so in that. But in terms of how they should be compensated, I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on that because mostly the market forces kind of dictate what that is. And, I'm not a capitalist, but like the NFL is purely a capitalist dream in terms of like the market dictates what peak players should get. Now, I certainly think, if I can say player X is worth Y because the market says that his position group makes, this amount of money in this sort of range. For example, like Caleb McGarry, a quality starting right tackle in the NFL makes between like $7 million and like $18 million. And I can say Caleb McGarry is worth this because his play is closer to the bottom half. So he should make 7 or 8 million or 10 or 11 million, 11 and a half, I think is what you wind up signing for. And I can say that, but outside of the parameters of what the market is dictating, I don't know if I really have a strong opinion on what a running back should be making. Now, my guess in terms of how running backs will be compensated moving forward, typically in the NFL, players seek guaranteed contracts. And I think that's going to be something. I don't think you're going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle and suddenly have running backs making big guarantees on a contract. There'll be exceptions here or there. Maybe that's Bijan Robinson. Maybe that's somebody else in the future. But I think probably what running backs are going to have to be more willing to do, again, because the market is kind of dictating this, is that they're going to have to try to make like incentive laden deals. Like, for example, Tony Pollard, if he thinks he should be making Nick Chubb money, which is $12 million a year, but Dallas is only offering him like $9 million a year, then he might have to accept a $9 million contract and make up the difference, that other $3 million that he thinks he should be able to get on the market with incentives built into his deal. So I don't know if your other questions are about like the position itself and why it's been devalued or whatever, but essentially from my perspective, and this is a very, very, very simplified version of this argument, but the argument for why running backs have been devalued is it's the idea that passing the football is worth 10 points and running the football is only worth like 5 points. And if you have a great quarterback or a good quarterback, you can consistently get, 8, 9, 10 points every single time you throw the ball. That even if you have a great running back, if you have a Derek Chubb, Henry or Nick Chubb or somebody, or an Adrian Peterson, that even they are only enhancing your running game to maybe it's now worth 6 points, right? And, the idea is that even having a lesser quarterback is still more valuable than having a great running back, right? Even a bad quarterback is worth like 5 or 6 points, and a great running back is at most worth like 6 points. So it's like even. And so the reason why there's this sort of anti using high premium picks on running backs and running game is because, it's better. It's more worthwhile for you to try to find ways to get your passing game, if it's say at a 6, to get it to an 8, than drafting a running back that's at best going to take your running game from a 5 to a 6, right? And I think the logic of that is very sound, right? But the reason why you heard me push back so much about positional value is you have to have context with that. And that is true in a vacuum, but that isn't true in reality, especially in this year's draft. There was no premier pass catcher, or at least the perception was that there was no premier pass catcher. Of course, somebody from this draft class is going to go on to be a very good wide receiver, and everybody's going to be like, oh, in 2 or 3 years when they're doing their redraft things, oh, this guy should have been a top 10 pick or whatever, and that happens. That's just the nature of the draft. But there was nobody perceived at the time that was worthy of that, right? You didn't have that conviction heading into the draft to get that player that's going to elevate that passing game. There was clearly no quarterback available for the Falcons, at least at pick 8, unless you believe that Will Levis is, the potentially great quarterback. And clearly most NFL teams did not agree with that assessment by him falling to round 2. And, of course, you can make the argument, well, the Falcons could have gone up and got one of the other quarterbacks, but we know that the Falcons timeline is not at a point where they should be trading it all for a quarterback, which was a part of the whole, this is why they're not going after Lamar Jackson. They are not a quarterback away. They still have a lot of building that they need to do, right? And even if for a cheap, young, good quarterback on a rookie contract, they still need a lot more pieces before they're ready to make that type of move. And so then the only real argument for the Falcons, at least at 8 this year, over taking, Bijan or something like that, is maybe taking an offensive lineman that may improve your offensive line and thus protect your quarterback so your passing game gets better. But really the only guy that was worth it for the Falcons at that pick was Peter Skoronski. And then again, that's another non-premium position like guard that you're pulling the trigger on. So that's not really a better option than taking the non-premium position at running back. And so then the Falcons really only option is defense. And that really was just, do you feel good about Jalen Carter? And the Falcons didn't love the person that Jalen Carter is. I don't know Jalen Carter, and so I can't really give them crap for, not loving the person. And time will ultimately tell if Jalen Carter is the person that lives up to the talent, the player that he is on the field. So that's kind of why, to me, despite the logic behind the positional value argument, I tend to dismiss it because, like, in a vacuum, sure, but like, if there's a Jamar Chase or Jalen Waddle in this draft class, you take that player over Bijan all day, every day. But like, there wasn't that guy, and so what are the Falcons going to do? Take the best player that you feel is the safest bet, the biggest bet, guaranteed double or whatever the case may be, with the potential to be a triple, but probably not a home run, right? In terms of the running back value. So that's what the Falcons did. I don't know, Space, if that answers your questions, but let me know if that's the case. But that's the end of the series part of today's episode. We'll have some fun to close out the show, answering a couple of listener questions, including pitting 2 alt-rock juggernauts from the 1900s against each other, at least on my playlist, as well as my super normal, not weird at all opinion about polar bears. So before we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I want to give another shout out to my everydayers. Next week, of course, training camp practices will be kicking off, and we'll be giving you those breakdowns. But we'll see what's what, and we'll see what we talk about next week. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. First question comes from Saint Jimmy. He asks, "I got a real zinger for you: Green Day or Blink 182?" So alternative is not necessarily my wheelhouse, but I do have opinions about it because I did grow up in the 1900s, and it was a very popular genre then. I'm sure it's still a very popular genre now. I have no idea who is sort of topping the charts at that time, because I'm at a point in my life where I'm not actively seeking out what's hot new music. I'm old and washed at this point in time. But this is an interesting question. Like, Blink 182 sort of hit big when I was in high school. Green Day sort of hit big when I was in middle school. I probably like more Blink 182 songs. Like, there's a larger number of their songs that I know and are memorable to me than Green Day. But like, the Green Day song to me is Basket Case, which came out in like 1994 or 93 or something like that. And that was like right when I was like really getting into music. And so I was like listening to hip hop at that time, Biggie and all that stuff. But like, Green Day, Basket Case is going to be one of those songs that like I'm going to remember when I'm like 80 years old, and I'll be able to sing that song when I'm 80, listening to old people's music at that. That's going to be weird. Rather than like jazz and whatever, old people's music was when I was growing up, it's going to be like Biggie Smalls and Green Day. So that's just weird. But Yeah, that's my opinion. So probably I'll take Blink 182, but basket case is a banger. Absolutely. Brigantor's question. He says, Aaron, what's your position on polar bears? So I don't have as strong a take on polar bears as I do on koalas, cheetahs, and what was the other garbage animal that I was bashing? Pandas. Um, I don't think I really have hot takes on any other animals other than those three. It's just those three animals to me. I have the spiciest take. So I have a super normal takes on polar bears. Like, they're like one of the baddest MFers on the planet in terms of like when I think of like what are the baddest things on the planet, it's like polar bears, orcas, and tigers are like the top three. I don't know who else would be on that Mount Rushmore off the top of my head, but those are the three that immediately come to mind. And so like I don't have strong takes on polar bears. Like they're probably the most ruthless animal on the planet because they live in a really hectic environment in the Arctic. And so therefore, like they don't know when their next meal is going to be. So if it moves, they will absolutely kill it and eat it. The old what's the adage where it's like if it when it talks about bears, if it's black, fight back, if it's brown, lay down, and if it's white, good night. And that's kind of my thoughts on polar bears. Like that perfectly sums up what a polar bear is. It is a ruthless killing machine, right? I know Coca-Cola has tried hard to make them cute and cuddly, but there is nothing cute and cuddly about a polar bear. It is to put it in football terms, it is the Aaron Donald of the animal kingdom, right? It is just like I don't want any part of that. It is going to absolutely annihilate me, and you just kind of you don't hold on for dear life with a polar bear. Like you actually, you can survive an Aaron Donald attack, right? You will be beat up for it. You will not survive a polar bear attack. So it is Aaron Donald times a million. That's basically my thoughts on a polar bear. So no spicy takes there. Um, you know, I know there was a couple other questions that people asked this week that I did not get to. That's it. That's it on the mailbag stuff. But one of those questions was, will I be at camp and will I be making it to games? I will not be at camp. I don't plan on going to camp. Some stuff came up, but we will have, people that are there at camp on the pod next week and the weeks thereafter to give their assessment. And, we'll get that breakdown that you guys need on the podcast on the daily. So continue to make us your first listen. And I don't plan on going into any games. Now I'm always open to going to games, but the main reason I don't go to games is just because like I'm already stressed about podcasting, trying to get the podcast up at a timely time after games on Sunday, the rapid reaction and the postcast and stuff. And like the added stress that would come from being at the game and still trying to do that to me just seems impossible. Now I know there are plenty of locked on hosts that do it. I know Jarvis does it when we do the postcast. You often see him inside the stadium do it. I don't know how they do that. Like that to me is just a level of stress that I want no part of. So generally I tend to not go to games for that very reason. Now we'll see. Again, I'm open to it, but I'm not like actively pursuing it. So that's the answer to those questions. So I hope those people aren't disappointed that they will not be seeing me sweating my butt off at the Georgia Heat over the next couple of weeks, nor are they disappointed that they won't randomly bump into me when I'm standing in line to get a hot dog and a beer at a football game. So sorry to disappoint you guys, but I'm very serious about what I do here on this illustrious podcast. So that is it, guys. I hope you have a great weekend. This is the final weekend that we have. Excuse me, sorry, before actual football practices, real practices, right? Not fake practices. I'm sure someone's like, you go out there and run around cones and push sleds in the heat in June, Aaron, and tell me that's not a real practice. But you know what I'm saying. We'll get some real games coming up in the next couple of weeks. So this is your final weekend to relax before football is back. So I hope you enjoy it because we are in a sprint after this point for the next 6 months. Yes, 6 months, 6.5, I guess. Hopefully we're still talking about Falcons playing football games in 6.5 months, but we'll see. We will see. So that's it, guys. Have a great weekend. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL as well as Locked On Sports Atlanta family of shows for your second listen. All part of Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.